Welcome to the What's Your Deal podcast, where we discuss business acquisitions, investments, management, and exit strategies. I'm your host, Matt Uhler. Let's dive in. Welcome to another episode of What's Your Deal. Today's a unique episode because today I'm actually the guest and my business partner, Sarah Rainwater, is the host. We've had a lot of our audience asking for more detail about some of the partnerships that I'm involved with, some of the businesses, and also the reason that I feel so passionate about some of the core principles that I've shared. For example, operating capital and semi-absentee ownership and partnerships. And those are what we're going to talk about today. And we're going to talk very specifically about a business that I have an ownership interest in that has been an enormous struggle for me since before COVID. Now, we've turned a corner, but there are so many valuable lessons within this story that I want to share that hopefully you'll get a whole lot of benefit from. Now, I do want to bring up that there's a lot of negative struggles that I'm going to be talking about. And it's not to be a downer, it's to be educational and also to hopefully drive the point home that these are why the fundamental principles that I feel so strongly about are so important. So without further ado, let's ask Sarah to introduce this deal and get started. Sarah, good to see you.
It's good to see you.
Thank you. So can you share with us a summary of this deal, just the basics of the deal that I got myself into?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack here. And I really want to kind of reiterate what you just said, that the reason we're going over this is because you and I were talking before this about how education is key and how stepping in and knowing what you potentially should have in your toolbox could help you handle situations like this when they come up. Because we know that as business owners, it might not be these exact struggles, but there will be times from time to time that there will be a struggle. And having, these fundamentals or these foundations and these tools can really make all the difference.
Yeah, absolutely. And honestly, it's part of what I appreciate so much about being in business and also struggle with is that, if I could have seen this stuff coming, I wouldn't have been in the business. I wouldn't have bought into the business. Mm-hmm. But life happens. And that's part of why these fundamental principles, I think, are so key that help me get to the other side in this deal.
Well, and I mean, we'll go over this and we'll talk about it, but essentially this deal checked all the boxes.
Absolutely.
And there would have been in hindsight's always 2020, mm-hmm. right? And there would have been no way for you to know what was ahead and coming for this business. So to give you guys a little bit of a background, this was a retirement community center.
Assisted living would be the technical term for it. Yep.
Okay. And it was purchased in September of 2019.
Isn't that perfect?
So as we move forward, I bet that our audience could probably see one of the big struggles that was about to take place. So purchased in September of 2019, industry assisted living facility, was in operation for 16 years before purchase, so had huge longevity. Mm-hmm. Which we know is one of the things that we look for 3 to 4 years of financial history. So having 16 years on the record was a huge asset. Yeah.
And back to the things we coach, proven recipe, right? They had a recipe of success for a long period of time. That's what I was intending to purchase and did purchase.
Right. Management structure, the operating partner who was previously a facility manager was paid a salary, so paid a fair and reasonable wage, and had an aggressive performance bonus. So again, another check.
Yeah, that's another part of the partnerships that I get involved with is where there's somebody who's, I call it boots on the ground. Mm-hmm. They are responsible for the day-to-day management because I cannot be.
Correct.
So big piece.
And number of partners, there was 10 partners in the initial deal, 3 managers and 7 passive. So more than enough people that ideally would have been boots on the ground in that moment.
Absolutely. And so for the managers, let me just explain. So those are managers of the entity. Mm-hmm. So those are the people in my partnership, which I was one of them and still am, that were responsible to the other partners to make sure that we guided that business correctly so they got what they invested in.
Okay. So, but there was an operating or a manager that had longevity with the business when you guys purchased it.
That's correct. And she was one of the entity managers. So what that looks like is it was her. Mm-hmm. She's running the day-to-day and paid to run the day-to-day. Mm-hmm. There's myself and another gentleman who are kind of the advisory board. that meet with the operations manager on a regular basis to make sure that the ship is going in the right direction.
Correct.
And then the other partners in this situation are passive. They don't need to be involved in the day-to-day in any way.
Which, in a lot of times, I've seen this work really well for you. So this is where we were heading. This, like we said, this checked a lot of boxes.
Most often it does.
Yes.
Yes. So again, if people want to talk about the success stories, those are there too.
Yes.
This structure works.
It does. And that's what and again, we don't want this to be a negative episode. We just want to talk about how important it is to be able to pivot and problem solve if situations were to arise.
In one of the podcasts we did with John, who was an MMA combat sport professional, he talked about how sometimes undefeated is a disadvantage. We learn the most from our failures, and this is a great example of that. I've learned an enormous amount from this transaction.
Well, and we'll get into it. So hopefully our audience will get this education and absorb it and not be scared by it, but just be like, man, this is something I can use if need be in the future. And going back September of 2019, we know what's coming because hindsight's 2020. So let's keep going down. Initial operating capital. So you guys had $75,000 set aside for situational happenings, and you're huge on operating capital, and we'll get into that in this episode.
Great,
but you're huge on operating capital, and there's a reason. And we'll cover that. Total purchase price, $1,850,000. $915,000 of that was for the business. $935,000 of that was for the real estate. Down payment for the business was $250,000. Again, initial operating capital, $75,000. And then you guys went through SBA financing. So can you kind of tell me a little bit of what that loan looked like?
Yeah. So the loan amount was $1,650,000, and it was a 25-year amortization because of the real estate in the business. So again, great amortization typically. And it was also 2 3/4 above prime, which is common.
Right.
So that was 8% at the time, which was fine. And but it was a variable rate.
Right.
Because it was hard to obtain fixed rates then, and rates were all over the place. Now, again, hindsight, rates have gone through the roof, which has been part of the struggle that we've dealt with this business. But that was pretty much the structure. And even the lender, this checked all their boxes. We had an operator who had experience in the industry and with this specific business. We had what I refer to as an advisory board, myself and others, who were there to make sure that if we hit a bump in the road, we could navigate it. So from a lending standpoint, aside from the operating partner not being as strong financially as she could have been, they loved the deal and no problem getting it approved.
Right. And so the anticipated ROI, so return on investment, was what you guys were anticipating was 20 to 27% based on the 1 to 3 year historical performance of this business. So it was, at the time, looked like a great investment opportunity.
That's another box that has to be checked for me. There has to be enough return to make it worth doing, and also to be able to sustain a rainy day if it comes along. And so that 20 to 27%, the reason there's that range is, as I looked back historically with our budget, in this year, it might have been 23%. If it had been that year, it would have been 25%. And so anyway, the high and the low of that range was 1 year, which would have been the worst year in that example, was 20%. And the best year, if we could recreate that, was 27%. So again, check the box. That works.
Right. And so I'll ask you, was this a deal or no deal? And I don't think there would be very many people, again, hindsight 2020, that wouldn't say, yeah, you take this. So was this a deal or no deal?
Absolutely a deal. And we'll talk through some of the things that hindsight would have revealed. But as an industry, is anybody expecting there to be less people in assisted living from 2019 on? No. And so really an industry that should have thrived, and there's been, it's back to maybe a norm now, but it's probably one of the industries that got hit the hardest with COVID. And so we'll being in
the fitness industry, I take that a little bit personal because I know that the other industries. No, I'm kidding, but yes, it was heavily impacted.
Yeah, and in the fitness industry, your customers don't die,
This is ideally
in the assisted living industry.
Yes. And that's a sad aspect of this story. It is. But it's the reality of this story as well. So this deal checked all the boxes. It was a strong industry. It was recession proof. There was experience management on board.
Mm-hmm.
It was established. It was financeable. So the lender liked the deal. And it had a healthy ROI prediction.
It checked all the boxes. Yes, on all fronts.
So in September of 2019, you guys moved forward.
That we did. We closed and celebrated.
Closed. Yes, because it seemed like a really good plan. So we move forward. What our audience knows is coming is the initial impact of 2020 of COVID.
Yeah, and there were some red flags that started before that. So if you don't mind, let me go back just a little bit where my operating partner, the one who had been managing the business, and I think it's safe to say that I was misled a little bit based on her experience because she worked for the previous owner, right? Now, no shortage of experience, but what I started to see as we move forward with us operating the business with her in the management role is that she was spending less time there than what we had agreed upon or than what the business needed. And a lot of that was falling to the assistant manager. So there were certainly some operational things that had occurred, let's say in the first 6 months, that became a little bit of a struggle and we needed to try to tighten up because operationally the business wasn't being managed as well as it needed to be. And I'm not going to say from a resident care perspective, but from a financial and strategy and that kind of perspective.
So she was this operating partner, she was an employee of the business prior?
She was.
And then she stepped in. Did she invest financially to become part of the partnership?
Great question. So part of the formula that I use in these types of partnerships was she invested a small amount of money, but she was the guarantor for the financing. Mm-hmm. So all of the other partners had no financial exposure other than their initial investment. Because she was the guarantor. She was the one with the experience. She was going to be the boots on the ground every day as the manager. And therefore, she was the only guarantor for the lender.
So, and if you don't mind me asking, as the guarantor for the lender, so how much of the business did she own stepping into it?
About 25, a little over 25%.
Okay.
As for that position.
Right.
And the reason her percentage is so high is because she was the guarantor.
Correct.
Yeah.
Right. And actually, this kind of leads into another question. SBA won't, if you're under a certain percentage, then you don't necessarily have to have any guarantees towards the loan.
Yeah. So to be specific, 20% or less. And again, it's got to be less, right? So 18, 15, something like that. I mean, you can't be 20% and not be pulled in as a guarantor.
Okay.
So part of the way I designed these, frankly, is that's why there was the number of partners there were, is because we all needed to be under 20% each in order to not be pulled into that deal as a guarantor. Mm-hmm. So they had one guarantor. Mm-hmm. They had an enormous amount of faith in me as a participant in the entity that I was going to make sure this worked out to the best of my ability, the way we agreed. Mm-hmm. And they had her personal guarantee.
Okay. So we had the initial impacts of COVID. And I think without going into massive depth of what those were, I think everyone could you can expand on it a little bit, but I think everyone has a pretty good grasp of how 2020 really negatively impacted this particular business.
Yeah, for sure. But there is some things that I think are worth pointing out because they play a role. So part of what happened is, let's say about 9 months after we had started. So let's say summer of 20, COVID had happened and we were doing fine, right? We had locked down the facility. Our residents were healthy. We were keeping COVID out of the facility. And so from that perspective, the business was still doing fine. What happened is the operating partner had a family emergency out of state. And so she asked if she could resign from that role.
And that was my next question is when did that actually happen?
So that happened when the business was still doing fine. But again, we were seeing some operational aspects that weren't meeting my expectations. She asked if she could resign. We went to the existing management, assistant managers, and so on and so forth within our staff. And I asked them, Are you interested in being promoted to step into this role? Now, again, no ownership, but are you interested in stepping into this role? And then myself as one of the entity managers and one of my partners who's also an entity manager, we're going to step up our game. So we will do this without the operating partner. We will do it with management that are staff. And we had that transaction come together. So the two key people at that time agreed, yes, they're up to the task. My partner and I, who were in a management role, agreed we're going to take on some more responsibility. And the partners agreed to let her resign and us move forward with the plan we had. So that was, call it summer of 20.
So this is a great example. I mean, it's a little bit of a unique situation because she was actually a partner in the business, but this is a great example of one thing that we talk a lot about when the idea of absentee ownership comes up is she was what we would call the key employee. And from September of 2019 to, let's say, summer, so June, July of 2020, that key employee was no longer. And what do you do as an absentee-owned business when the person running the day-to-day leaves, right?
Well, and this is why I'm so hard on this. Now, again, there's lots of people that run businesses absentee, and it can be done, but I'm hoping that this is a phenomenal example of what can show up and how that can change things. And so right off the bat, the manager and the assistant manager were doing a great job managing the day-to-day. But what they cannot do is deal with some of the insurance details. Those start falling on me. They can't deal with, maybe because I didn't want them to, but again, I've got partners that I'm responsible to. They can't deal with the financials at the same level that an owner could, right? So they're hiring, firing. I mean, there's all those aspects that can be very tricky for somebody depending on their qualifications if they're just an employee manager as opposed to an owner operator partner.
Right. And I just having that overview vision of the business, like when a owner walks in and they have eyes on different situations, they're likely going to see things that, might not be seen by a typical employee. Well,
and you'll 100% for sure. And the person who we promoted as the manager, phenomenal woman, again, amazing heart, dedication like to no end. And as we progress through the story, hopefully that is presented because it couldn't be more true. So she gave it and still is giving it everything that she has, but she's not an owner. And she's not involved in all of the dynamics that involve partners and partnerships and lenders with $1.6 million in debt and all of those factors. She can't do it.
Right. Yeah. And this will be a great example as we get into it later of one of the tools that you use to kind of secure that position down. And we won't disclose it right now, what you did with that, manager who was keeping this thing afloat right in that moment. But it ended up being a great situation, and we'll get to there. But so let's keep talking about some of the struggles. So during COVID, there was massive employment issues, staffing issues, and this was a 24/7 facility, correct?
Yeah, and so just to back up for 1 second, so December of 2020 is when we got hit hard.
Okay.
So we were able to keep all of our residents healthy and everything was fine until December of 2020, and we had our change in management that we've already discussed. But it was in December of 2020 that we lost about 40%, 45% of our residents to COVID.
Wow.
And it got in the facility, and not only was it in the facility and devastating for some of the residents, which is painful to witness for them and their families, but we also had staff.
Right.
And so when staff get infected with COVID, our job is to care for them, not the staff, for the residents. But then all of a sudden we have staff that can't come to work for 10 days
right.
or
and
2 weeks.
And if I remember correctly, there was some sort of policy that if somebody in the beginning, so it was if a staff member had tested positive for COVID, it was like a guaranteed 2 weeks off, right? And for us, it was a guaranteed 2 weeks paid. I refresh my memory, but I do remember something of that sort.
Yeah. So financially, this huge significance to that.
Well, there wasn't anyone there doing the job. You needed someone there doing the job. People were getting sick. And then, of course, you were paying to have someone not be there, and then you were having to pay again to have somebody try to find somebody to be there.
Well, and there's two points to that are interesting to ponder for a second. We can't close the doors. Mm-hmm. It's not like, listen, just put a closed until Monday sign up. We got people we need to care for.
Absolutely.
And the other point is that when you put a help wanted, come help us with a COVID-infested facility, not many people show up.
Right.
So literally myself and my managing partner and I are contemplating, like, what do we do if there's nobody who can take care of these people? Do we bring them to the fire department? Bring them to the emergency room? What do we do? Because there's nowhere for them to go. Mm-hmm. So again, as people are thinking about, this isn't designed to scare you, because this whole story comes to a happy ending. Mm-hmm. But these are the kinds of things that business owners face sometimes.
Right. And this was incredibly circumstantial.
Totally.
Because of, and there were so many lives and so many industries that were impacted by 2020. But this just happened to be a deal that you closed on in, again, September of 2019. And, there was a lot of hurdles that you had to jump in a short amount of time.
Yeah. And again, the magic in all of this is the fundamentals. Mm-hmm. So my managing partner, the one who's not working there day to day, but is part of the advisory board, has direct industry experience. Mm-hmm. So again, without my direct industry experience, I'm able to lean on him, and he's totally current with the policies that are related around COVID and the things that need to be done, and where do you go if you can't care for people, and so again, back to why isn't experience so important? Well, when it comes to a situation like this, it was invaluable to have somebody on my team that knew this industry frontwards and backwards and was able to help guide the ship as well.
Right. And that would be direct industry experience.
100%. Direct, yes, as opposed to transferable. Correct. So I have transferable. Mm-hmm. I know how to manage people. I have employees. I understand financial statements, customer service. He's in the industry. That's direct.
So then you started meeting regularly with the management team. So you went from being what you thought would be an absentee owner, and then you were, you had said you went from thinking that this was going to be a 5-hour a month commitment to it being a 5-hour a week.
Yeah,
if
5
not more.
plus hours a week.
Yeah. So quickly that changed for you.
It did. Yeah. And there's something here too, and I know we're going into the weeds, but I'm hoping there's enough value here that people can really extract what's beneficial. Mm-hmm. So I know a lot of very successful business people that when a business is starting to slide or struggle, they turn away from it and they focus on what is working. Let's say they own lots of businesses. They focus on what is working. And I understand that ideal and that approach. To me, it's very different when you have partners, because there are people that have put their faith, in this case, in me to help steer this company. Mm-hmm. So it's not like, I don't have that much money in this thing. It's not, I can just move on. So my position on something like this business when it starts to struggle is to increase my focus, because generally when you increase focus, you get results. And so, yes, this went from a 5-hour a month obligation to me to 5+ hours a week of trying to crack the code so that I could help get my partners what they expected, take care of all of these residents and provide them with a place to live, and then also all of the people that counted on this business for their income.
Right. And I think there's two things there. One, I think that's why it's so amazing to buy or invest in small businesses, because our work ethic is kind of second to none. Mm-hmm. Like I say we because I've been in small business, pretty much my entire adult life. But we will go the distance normally before we will let something falter or fail at the tune of no sleep or, and when we don't have to do that, that's great. But there's definitely those moments that we do. And this is a prime example of how this turned into, for you, being one of those moments. And the second thing that I'm hearing here is really quick, how far was this business from you?
Great point. So this business is located about 1 hour and 15 minutes away from me. Mm-hmm. My other managing partner lives in the community. So I was relying heavily on him to be more present. But it also required a 3-hour round trip for me to be on site taking care of things. And to the point that you shared, when you think about 5 hours a week as opposed to 5 hours a month, just some of the examples of where this came about was we ended up with a water leak. Literally, we got a pond where there was no pond. So we're calling plumbers, we're calling irrigation people, we're calling all these people. They all cost money for a business that's trying to rebuild from losing half of its residents almost. Mm-hmm. We're not interested in spending thousands and thousands of dollars. And it became a point where literally myself and my managing partner were waist deep in a ditch filled with water, finding this water leak that nobody else could find. And it ended up being, as silly as this sounds, it ended up being faulty joints, plumbing joints. Mm-hmm. So literally we'd find one, fix it, bury it, and then it'd be the one further up the line. So, literally we're shoveling ditches to keep the money in the bank and to do whatever we can to crack the code on this.
There's a reel going around on social right now, or Instagram, what have you, and it's like a day in the life of a business owner, and it's the right. The operator of the train, and he's in front of the train throwing railroad ties off, and as soon as he gets like one railroad tie that's on the train track, then there's another one, and he's running and throwing that way out of the way of the train, and then this story that you just said reminded me of that. You fix one leak, and then there's another leak right down the way, and
is mind-boggling. Literally the 3 elbows in this plumbing system that were faulty, and we just kept chasing them. But it had to be done.
Right.
And again, did it have to be done? No, we could have just thrown in the towel and let everybody lose the money and default with the bank and send all these residents to some other. It just was not an option.
Well, and for us, what we want to try to convey to people, like through this story and as us as a business, is, if you're buying a business that is 8 hours away from your home, mm-hmm. and something like this comes up, how many plane tickets are you purchasing a month now mm-hmm. to go, and again, it's not necessarily, well, I'll just hire somebody to do that. Well, I can ask you, my next question is, how quickly did you guys go through that $75,000 of working capital, right?
Oh, yeah, it was.
To where you had to be boots on the ground.
Yeah, so it's a great question, and I don't know the exact time frame, but I can tell you we, at like almost every other business, took advantage of PPP loans and EIDL loans and all of these things. Mm-hmm. But when you have the number of residents we have and the staff to care for them, and then you drop 45% of those, we were losing significant money immediately. And as we're trying to attract new residents, right, we're going through this process. That's not an overnight process, right? So it takes many, many months to get back up to the level of occupancy we were at when it made the 20 to 27% return. COVID struck again. And so we ended up losing again about almost 50% of our residents after having built it back up. We lost them all, or half of them again ended up passing away because of COVID, and we were right back where we started. So we had, if I had to think accurately, I would say we had 2.5 years of very, very significant deep losses.
Right, and you mentioned the PPP, the EIDL. You were also putting forth bridge loans personally, correct?
Yeah, and again, this is a fine line because I'm not a guarantor on the loan. Mm-hmm. I literally had partners and the lender saying, buddy, listen, if you want to throw in the towel, we get it. Nobody's going to blame you. Mm-hmm. It just didn't feel right to me. And so when there was times when the business needed money, I would step in with more money and create a bridge loan or do something, again, based on my faith in the team and maybe my faith in lots of things. But it's just what I did. So
well, and it's not like this was just a Main Street business, like you said, where you could just close the doors and keep paying the lease on it, perhaps, and just buckle down and hope for better days in the future. I mean, this was morally, you were caring for people that relied on the business.
100%.
Right.
Yeah. One other piece, and not to add more pain to the story, but during this time, you may remember that interest rates went up. So our payment went from about $12,000 a month to about $16,000 a month at a time that we're already not being able to generate the revenue we need because of the dynamics that are going on in the world. And so, so yeah, I was feeling pretty heavy.
Well, and you even, you came up with some creative ways to maybe try to kind of build it back or what have you. But let's kind of switch gears. So what what ended up happening with the original operating partner? So she resigned, but she was still on as a partner. She was still a guarantor of the loan.
So and it's kind of interesting how this occurred. So she just became a regular partner, right? No longer a managing partner, and just received distributions if there were any to be had. Now, again, during this time, there weren't any to be had because the business was suffering such significant losses. But unfortunately, she found herself in a financial problem. And I got a call from the bank one day saying, hey, we've got an issue because she was intended to file bankruptcy. And so that opened up this whole new dynamic with our lender of their only guarantor is planning to file bankruptcy. So then once she does that, the loan becomes in technical default, which means we've defaulted on our loan even though we're still making payments. That's a problem.
That does seem to be a problem. So she was filing bankruptcy personally.
That's right.
She was the guarantor of the loan, and that basically just told the lender, like, we got to figure this out.
Well, so that triggered several dynamics. So one for me was, how do we replace her? Now, again, do I want to replace her as a guarantor? Of course, I do not. That was not what I signed up for. But what does the bank need to do? Well, because it's an SBA guaranteed loan, the bank needs approval from the SBA with what's going to happen in this dynamic if they no longer have a guarantor and we're technically in default. It also triggers us looking at, okay, what do we need to do as partners to potentially reposition this property to turn it into something that is viable and sustainable in light of the circumstances. And so for us, that looked like, because it was built to house so many people, maybe we turned it into a recovery center. Maybe we turned it into housing for veterans. I mean, and again, that would be something that we could control and transition over time as opposed to just failing and needing to find a place to send all these people that were our residents.
Well,
so we looked at all of those options.
And the lender wasn't interested in taking the business because
It's a great point. You know, having done this for so long, I don't believe that any lender is excited to take something back.
Right.
But in this situation and in this business, do they want to take back a business that's full of elderly people that need to be cared for? Absolutely not. And so they were very cooperative, and I appreciate how cooperative they were, and I've worked with them for a long, long time, so it's a relationship. What they expected from me was clear communication about what's going on, and we brainstormed a lot about how to keep us taking care of those residents as opposed to just me throwing in the towel or all of us throwing in the towel, and then them being faced with serious operational concerns that they do not want as a bank.
Right. So we have this new hurdle in front of us. So explain to me how with the lender, you guys had gotten over this newest hurdle.
Yeah. So what I started looking for was another operating partner and somebody who could step in and become the new guarantor for the lender, and we're good to go. And the original partner, and bless her heart for this, I mean, she was prepared to just surrender her interest to no longer have that obligation on her. So again, we had a very good plan there in place, but two things occurred. One was that the original operating partner ended up filing without our notice. So then that's done. And the person that was going to replace her couldn't qualify with the lender. So we're kind of back to right where we were, which is, okay, now we're technically in default on this loan because of this bankruptcy, and we don't have anybody to replace the guarantor nor an owner operating partner, which is, again, key in my formula for these things.
And talking really quick about your formula, because as I'm hearing this, I almost want to be like, there's so many good partnerships where this has worked great. I mean, you and I are a great example of that, or you and Audrey and Travis and I in our partnership with another entity. And I've seen this work so well. But one of the big things that you present in your partnerships is a very thorough operating agreement and I would say a lot of these things are learning opportunities. Like we now know, okay, this could happen, AKA the bankruptcy and her filing without notice and all those fun little surprises. But when you establish partnerships, you do have a very thorough operating agreement that goes, if this happens, then this happens. If this happens, then this happens. And this is a whole nother discussion for a whole nother podcast. But setting up successful partnerships is just complete transparency and, roadmap. So I'm hoping that, our audience is able to start thinking about that and not be shied away from partnerships because, again, there's so many great ones out there. But having that operating agreement is such a valid way to form a partnership.
It really is. And I think it's important to have the document, right? To refresh everybody's memory about what they agreed upon. But the thing I like about the document is that it forces me and my partners or prospective partners to talk through the what ifs.
Yeah.
It's so easy to have rose-colored glasses on when you enter into any business or partnership or anything that's exciting. You focus on what's exciting.
And human nature tends to do that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so to me, it's important to what I call pressure test the relationship with some of the stuff that's not fun to talk about.
Yeah.
And so, yes, I continue to learn with every business that I own, and every day that I'm in business, I learn something new and become wiser. And yeah, the operating agreement was designed to address a lot of these factors. But again, there was just so many outside influences that some of it just becomes creativity and intuition and hard work to get to the other side.
So how did the lender agree to let go of her ownership? How did that end up panning out?
Yeah. So what we talked about with the lender was that I would become a limited guarantor. And the details of this there's some details in this, but right at the moment, if we play this out, they had a guarantor that was bankrupt who was guaranteeing, call it $1,600,000. So no benefit there. So almost anybody that's not bankrupt is going to be better for them. And they just want the payments to continue. They don't want the business back or the real estate back for that matter. That's not what they're after. And so I was able to negotiate with them. And again, negotiate might sound like a strong word, but I was able to design a guarantee arrangement where I was able to pledge a limited guarantee, which is honestly a very, very, very small amount of money compared to the debt, which was way better than what they had. And that became enough justification because of who I am in my relationship with them and them checking their box that, yes, we now have a guarantor, limited guarantor, but we have a guarantor to allow us to continue to proceed.
Right.
The other advantage of that, again, as it turned out, was that had the people who were going to be the new replacement operating partner stepped in, well, then they would have been obligated for $1.6 million in debt. As it turned out, it became a far better arrangement for my limited guarantee to be in place than for somebody else needing to guarantee $1.6 million in debt.
Right.
And I'm going to say my guarantee, without disclosing the exact amount, is pennies on the dollar. And so for me, it was a risk I was willing to take because of the business and what I believed in the people and my team to put that guarantee forth and also to solve this problem. So we no longer had that pressure of technical default.
Right. So that was, that got her out.
It did.
And it got the team kind of back together to start really rebuilding at this point.
Yeah, and let me just provide...
And surviving still.
Surviving. Yes, let me provide one more detail. I purchased from the bankruptcy court her interest.
Oh, okay.
Okay, and that's again, we could do this for days, but that was a whole nother experience that I had never been through. But again, I needed to capture her interest in order to be able to move forward with the business in the future.
What would have happened if you couldn't have captured her interest?
Great question. So she would have just retained her interest.
Oh.
So because it was I'll call it the majority, just because everybody else was under 20%. If they couldn't sell her interest, if the bankruptcy court could not sell her interest, then ultimately it's not an asset that they want. It just goes back to her.
Oh.
And for me, being the person who's putting even more on the line and years of effort, I don't want her to have her interest back, and for me not to be able to use that as a tool to ultimately try to, as we'll get to, rebuild this business in a way that it was originally designed.
And this is a lot of hurdles So this is all less than, are we past summer of 2020 by this point?
Absolutely. So just from a time perspective, so summer of 2020 is when our operating partner resigned. December of 2020 is when we had our first significant COVID outbreak.
Correct.
Roughly a year later, we had our next significant COVID outbreak. So let's call it December of 21.
Okay.
So this is over a period of, let's call it 2.5 years or so that all of these pieces are playing out. And it was actually, just for perspective, it was actually, call it spring of 24, when I was acquiring her interest from the bankruptcy court and finalizing the details with our lender. And part of what had occurred is we got our feet under us. COVID's no longer an issue. We were starting to be able to fill the facility back up, stabilize our staffing. So there was some light at the end of the tunnel, which is also why I was re-injecting capital and effort into trying to get to the finish line of this being back to a successful, sustainable, stable business.
Well, and I'm convinced that you were able to get to the finish line because, like in our last episode with Coach John, with the MMA and the mental toughness, he talked a lot about reps, right? And just having the experience and putting in the reps to where when obstacles arise, you almost muscle memory know how to move forward, or you have the tools in your toolbox. Now, a first-time business owner, I'm not convinced after this they would be a second-time business owner with this particular deal.
Probably not.
But what we're trying to do here is provide the information so a first-time business owner can start putting these tools in their toolbox, or at least have the mental capacity to think about this might happen. But you, and we'll talk about this in the next part, but you got this business over the hump where I'm not sure there's very many other people who could have done that.
Well, it's a great point. One of the things that we talked about with Coach John is being able to take hits, right? And the more experienced you are in most things, the more capable you are of taking a hit. And so when I get a phone call from my manager that says let's call it half, but 45% of our residents passed away in the last 7 days, wow. That's a pretty significant hit. And back to Coach John, he's got a plan A, a plan B, a plan C for every situation that shows up in his combat sport world. And for me, that's exactly what I was doing. Okay, plan A, failed. Plan B, let's look at that. Plan C, here's what we need. Plan D. And so those plans, and we'll call them tools in your toolbox.
Or ABC, your ABCs.
ABCs, they come from reps and experience. And again, this is, I have one other business partnership that struggled to probably as equal of a level, and again, finished out to be a successful business story. But those were the biggest hits that in my business career I have ever had, is these two businesses during COVID that put me to the test and made me rise to the occasion. And they were tough.
Right. And we definitely don't want to belittle or skim over the impact of losing residents, and how sad, that truly was. And another thing as a business owner in 2020 was the emotional tolls that this took. Not only, were we striving, one, to stay healthy as individuals like everyone else, two, to keep these businesses afloat, and then three, carrying the emotional, we're not robots, so carrying the emotional toll of, losing 45% of your residents. It's, that's, as business owners, that's just not a number for us. Those are individuals. Those are real people. And I think a lot of business owners, felt in some capacity through COVID, just that reality as well.
100%. And if you've not been in assisted living, you wouldn't know this, but the reality is when somebody passes and there's a caregiver who has been caring for that person for years, it hurts.
Yeah.
And COVID was so scary with everything that was going on anyway, including in the media, that if you're working in a facility and literally that number of people that you had been caring for and were just talking to the day before pass away, it's not simple.
No, it's not.
It's not easy, and it's painful. And we had staff that literally needed time off. or just didn't want to continue in the career anymore because of the devastation that was going on a human level, aside from the business level.
Right. And, and I mean, like we talked about, things come up in business all the time. COVID was definitely a very circumstantial situation where I kind of joke, actually I made this joke a little bit earlier today where I was talking to somebody about it, and the level of which they expected us to know all the answers. And I was just like, well, forgive me, this is my first pandemic.
Yeah.
And it's, there was a lot of learning that happened, and a lot of businesses had to get really creative to stay in business. And a lot of businesses didn't make it. And so you obviously fought real hard to keep this business in business. And I kind of want to wrap up on this part one and kind of lead into part two, because where part one was a little heavy, I think this episode, and we want to reiterate that there's positivity that comes out of this story. Part one was pretty heavy. It was a heavy time. It was, I'm sure for you, a heavy time as a business owner, but flowers have grown from this story. So I want to lead, and I'll let you lead into closing this episode out and then navigating into part two. But like you said, this ends up being a success. And it's because you had the reps, the tools, the education and the experience and the resilience to make this work.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you teed it up that way, because the reality is this is a phenomenal story of struggle in business. But this is life, right? I mean, we've all been through similar situations in life where something shows up and surprises us, and we didn't want it. We wouldn't ask for it again. And it gives us an opportunity to grow and learn. And in my belief system, if we get to the other side of that, we're stronger, we're wiser. And for me, I want to be better off from a situation like this. And that's why I'm also excited about part two, is to, there's light at the end of the tunnel. And some of the fundamental principles that we discuss that are important in business prove to bear fruit. And that's what's exciting about part two.
Well, they proved to be true. Have enough operating capital, have your foundation in place, have your expectations in line or realistic, and all those foundations and fundamentals that you really preach on, just turned out to be truth and turned out to be the reason why this business ended up being a success story.
Yeah, honestly, and again, it's not about me. It was about a team of people that all cared.
Yes, absolutely.
That's the only reason this business is still there.
I love that.
Yeah.
That's very good. Well, I guess we can close it out if you want to give out the final closings. And then I will say, hopefully everyone sticks around for part two to see how this actually turned around and became a really great success.
Yes. Well, thank you for joining us in part one. And again, we hope that you'll listen to part two for the light at the end of the tunnel. And that, as with all of our podcast episodes, that you will take every nugget that's here available for you to help you be more successful in your future business endeavors. And that's a wrap on today's episode. We hope you enjoyed the conversation and got some valuable insights into the world of buying and selling businesses. Want to be a guest on our show? If you have a deal that you'd like to discuss with us or a business story to share, we'd love to hear from you. Shoot us an email using the contact information below in the episode notes, and let's make this happen. Never miss an episode. Make sure you subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. And if you found today's episode helpful, please leave us a review. It helps more people like you find the show.